I never thought about what money was until the COVID lockdowns, and then the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate to zero. And I had a lot of money in the bank generating zero. And then it occurred to me that the prices were going to go up quite a lot. And I started thinking about a couple of concepts. One is, what is money? And the second is, what is inflation? And then the third is, what is wealth and how do you preserve wealth? Well, a simple answer to what is money is economic energy. Money is you have a certain amount of wealth, and economic energy could be viewed as capital, could be viewed as wealth. And we oftentimes store our economic energy in different assets. We could store it in a currency like the dollar. We could store it in a bar of gold. We could store it in diamonds. We could store it in a Ferrari. We could store it in a house, in a building, in a warehouse, or we could buy a share of stock. These are all different ways to store our wealth, our economic energy. And they all serve as sort of money. Now, the question is, which of those assets is the best money? Now, I think the thing to keep there in mind there is if money is energy, the energy dissipates with a certain time frame. So, for example, if you had $100,000 in the year 1930, you could have bought a very, very nice house in Miami Beach. I know because I own a house built in 1930, and the deed of sale is for $100,000 on 2 acres in the middle of Miami Beach. That house was appraised at $46 million in about 90 years later. Okay. So if you actually are good at math, you can calculate that what that means is approximately a 99.8% loss in the purchasing power of the dollar over 90 years. Or if you do exponential math in your head, I can tell you the answer. It's 7% inflation rate. The inflation rate of real estate in Miami Beach over the last century is 7% a year. Now, the politicians and the government agencies will tell you that inflation target is only 2%. Or they'll tell you CPI is 2%. But in fact, the inflation rate of consumer goods that are manufactured, like, I don't know, like cardboard boxes of milk or cardboard boxes of water or drywall or Netflix videos or biscuits coming out of an assembly line or chocolate bars that come out, 1 million an hour. Yeah, those things are going up in price, but they're not going up at 7% a year because technology and capital investment and human ingenuity is actually making it cheaper, right? You can reasonably conclude that we're better at manufacturing things today than 100 years ago. So, of course, things that are manufactured get a little bit cheaper. But what can't you manufacture more of? And it's like beachfront property in Miami. Okay, so if you actually calculate the inflation rate of scarce desirable assets like beachfront property, it isn't 2%, it's 7 or 8%. The same is true of real estate in London, Paris, LA, any place desirable. It turns out the inflation rate of the S&P index of a scarce desirable company, one of the 500 best run companies in the United States, that's also 7%. Right? The government would tell you that's not inflation, that's just that's asset appreciation. They'll say, good for you. Homeowners' values of their homes went up 7% this year, and the value of your stock went up by 7% this year. But what they're missing is that the average person's salary isn't going up by 7%. So it gets harder and harder and harder for people to buy scarce, desirable things. I think once I got into this business, I realized that the dollar is not a good monetary instrument because it loses 7% of its purchasing power a year. But foreign currencies, like the peso or the lira or something, they lose 14% or more of their purchasing power every year. They're even worse. Now, if you're an engineer, you think in terms of half-life. The question is, what's the half-life of your money? Like, what's the half-life of your economic energy? When the inflation rate of the dollar is 7%, it means that every 10 years you lose half your wealth. When the inflation rate is 14%, it means every 5 years you lose half your wealth. Gold has an inflation rate of 2%. It turns out the gold miners create 2% more gold every year. That means every 35 years you lose half your wealth. So the half-life of money in each of those instruments, each of those assets, ranges from a couple of years in a commodity to 10 years in the world reserve currency to 35 years in the dollar. Now, what's the half-life of money in Bitcoin? See, Bitcoin is designed to go asymptotically to 21 million. So, in fact, the inflation rate of Bitcoin over the next 100 years is effectively nothing. Like we've got 19.5 million Bitcoin now, and we'll have 21 million in 100 years. So you're going to get another few percent over the course of 100 years, and then you're going to get nothing more for all of eternity. So if you think about it like that, you realize that the half-life of your money in the right crypto asset in this Bitcoin network is in essence infinite, which makes the money immortal. Now, think about the implications of having a half-life of 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years or forever. When the half-life is forever, the money is immortal. That means your economic energy doesn't dissipate. When the money is being debased, you're in essence draining the economic energy out of the currency. You're bleeding every company. Now, if I raise the supply of dollars 7% a year for 100 years, any corporation that's valued based on cash flows has to grow its cash flows more than 7% a year in order to maintain its value constant. If you're growing at 3% a year and the money supply is growing at 7.5% a year, over the course of 100 years, $1 million company is only worth $30,000. So you're getting destroyed because you have a negative 3.5% real yield. If you actually have a stock and you want the stock to hold value and your value based on cash flows, your cash flows have to grow faster than the monetary inflation rate. Now, bear with me. What happens when the monetary inflation rate goes to 14%? You have to grow at 20%. What happens when it grows to 20%? You have to grow at 30%. How many companies can grow their cash flows 20% a year for 20 years in a row? Well, since the beginning of the year, the S&P 500 is up about 11%. 7 companies in the S&P 500 account for 52% gain. Companies have 1.5% of all the companies are all the gain. And that's because if you're not a digital monopoly, right? If you're not a monopoly with the ability to create a product with no variable cost, you can't keep up with the inflation rate. Now, which companies can actually create products with no variable cost? They're monopolies, right? Big tech, right? So they sort of do okay. Now, what's the other organization that can create money with no variable cost that's a monopoly? The central bank, the Federal Reserve, right? They can create $1 trillion of dollars that cost nothing, that are worth $1 trillion. Now they sell that into $50 trillion economy, so they kind of they debase everybody by 2% or something, right? But that means that they created $1 trillion that are worth 99% of what $1 trillion were worth a year ago. It's pretty good business for them if you have the world reserve currency. But what this means in the economy is the only companies that will actually last for generations are companies where the majority of the balance sheet is denominated as scarce desirable property, right? So if you think about all the rich families, the ones whose grandfather bought city blocks in the middle of Manhattan, or they own buildings in London, right? Or they own the New England Patriots. If you own a piece of intellectual property or real estate property, If you own $1 billion worth of buildings on January 1st, and the bankers are going to print 10% more money, or 10% more currency, to be precise, then you can expect that your $1 billion building will be worth $1.1 billion at the end of the year with you doing nothing. And if you have a company which generates $1 billion of cash flow by being a restaurant or a hotel chain or a dry cleaner or sweeping the streets or manufacturing plastic straws or operating cruise ships, that company is going to have to generate 10% more cash flow, $100 million additional cash flow, in order to be worth the same amount as they were on the first day of the year. So you see how pernicious this is, right? It's very unfair to property poor, operations rich. Like, the working class suffers, whether it's a working class company or just a working class person. The doctor that makes $200,000 a year has to make 10% more after tax next year to be worth the same as they were last year. So the working class suffers, the working class companies suffer. The property class, they sort of benefit if you just own stuff, right? Wall Street, you just own things. You don't do anything. You just own stuff. And then the question of how well you do is a function of the quality of the stuff you own. So if you own scarce, desirable property, the best is probably high quality luxury real estate or commercial real estate that everybody wants. You kind of barely keep up with inflation. You might get 1 or 2% more than inflation, maybe. If you own the S&P index, you just kind of keep up with inflation. It's the same. 7% inflation, 7% S&P return. If you own bond portfolios, you're going to lose half your stuff, right? Your yield is negative 3% a year. You lose 3% of everything you own every year, at best, maybe faster. So Bitcoin represents something special because it's sound money, which means, if you have sound money, you actually don't have to grow your cash flows faster than the rate of inflation to actually live happily ever after. For example, that doctor that's making $200,000 a year, if they sweep their excess savings into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has been going up 40% a year, but let's say over time it goes up about 14% a year versus the 7% of the inflation rate and 7% of the S&P index. A company with a low growth rate, but holding a balance sheet that's got a high growth rate, is a well-endowed institution, right? You can grow your salary by 3%, but your balance sheet will grow by 14%, and the inflation rate only is 7%. So you actually get ahead of the curve.
Small ebook, big impact, the wealth tree. The only 4 ways that will make you financially free forever. Download it here for free.